So you've made it to the third video. First of all, thanks for watching. Number two, some people have asked me, why not a list of my top choices for progressive rock music? The truth is, I've seen a lot of these videos on YouTube already. Some of them I actually like this one right here. I'm giving you a link to Pete Pardo's list. This guy holds a channel called Sea of Tranquility, and I really think this is one of the most comprehensive list of top progressive rock albums of the 1970s. He's got even more than one video on the subject, but this one would be like good starter's point. His list is very long, and it might be a bit overwhelming for some of you guys. So if you're looking for a shorter list with a lot of choices that I actually agree with, this other guy, I don't know his name, but I think it's Classical Album Review or something like that. That's the name of his channel. Anyway, check him out. He's got 10 albums that I think are the top of progressive rock. Anyway, on with my list. Number 4. Now, talking about people who you probably will never be able to really understand what they're singing about. You can, their websites dedicated to try to decodifying or deciphering the lyrics of their songs. This is the Cocteau Twins, popular band from the 80s and the 90s. The Cocteau Twins, their singer, Elizabeth Fraser, was capable of singing in a style that it's called glossolalia, or, it's basically using words and sounds in a sort of a phonetic style that will privilege form over function. Those are not words to be heard and to signify. They're simply words to be heard as instrumental music. It's amazing what she does with her singing. Now, Victorialand is the Cocteau Twins album that I always go back to when I want to hear an entire work by them, an entire album. Every song is linked. Every song has a place in the album. It's actually, for a band that was known for a heavy use of processed guitar and synthesizers, it's probably their most stripped down album. Delicate sounding album. And in that sense, it's really minimal to the stuff that we were used to hear from the Cocteau Twins. If you've never heard any band from the 4AD label, this is probably your best entry point, not only to the Cocteau Twins repertoire, but also to the 4AD label, which had a lot of interesting bands that were quite experimental at the time. Cocteau Twins music, it tends to be quite beautiful. They make these gorgeous sounds, especially Elizabeth Fraser's voice. But if you've never ever heard of these guys, I suggest you give a try to Victorialand. It's probably the most rewarding album as a whole. Now, number 3, it's a really interesting pick. I thought about several albums by David Bowie that could have been in the list. I thought about Heroes, I thought about Station to Station. I even thought about, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. But if we're trying to give a recommendation to people who are used to listening stuff by bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, Van der Graaf Generator, early Genesis, Yes, I think Low is that one album which you can listen to it as a whole. I usually tend to think of it as an entire piece. It's just one big suite. We have to understand, Bowie at the time was collaborating with people like Brian Eno. He was collaborating with people like Mr. King Crimson himself, Robert Fripp. So, he had all these inputs coming in from everywhere. And then Bowie himself, was, a theatrical presence, a dramatic presence in the music. I think Low really captures that moment, that milieu, el entorno, that really moment in time. To me, it's his most rewarding album. I listen to it quite often. and I really enjoy, you know, those ambient moments, this just sounds just cruising through your ears. I mean, like, Low is probably my favorite of all of Bowie's albums. So number 2, now here is an interesting pick. Most people who listen to prog music will run away from new wave bands. Bands like Duran Duran and Depeche Mode. Back in the 80s, you know, people who listened to prog music were on one side and people who listened to new wave music were on another side. And it was really unfortunate because a lot of progressive bands started to record albums, you know, that sounded, that were sort of flirting with all that new waves, all those new wave sounds. I mean, take for instance, I mean, Yes 90125 is really a piece that tries to work in new wave sounds into Yes repertoire. Then again, for number 2, I picked a real new wave album. This is a really new wave band, Remaining Light by Talking Heads. Now, you can take any of the first 4 Talking Heads albums and you can put it in this list without a problem. I couldn't pick all 4, so I picked one of them, Remaining Light, which is my favorite. But you can take Talking Heads 77, you can take More Songs About Food and Buildings. You can take any of those 4 first albums and you can really put them in a list like this. I know, all those first 4 albums are fascinating, but I find Remaining Light probably their most cohesive, the most organized album. It almost sounds like a concept album when you listen to it, you know, at least in musical, instrumental terms. It really is, you know, conceptually super tight. You might ask yourself, what is a Talking Heads album doing in a list of recommendations for prog rockers? Well, here's the deal. Remaining Light has guitar work by Adrian Belew, a guy who was going to go on and work on the transformation of King Crimson during the 80s. You know, King Crimson broke up during the 1970s after Red, and then the band was transformed in the 80s. Robert Fripp, Adrian Belew, and Bill Bruford recorded Indiscipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair. You know, and those 3 albums are really, you know, part of that new face of King Crimson during the 1980s. Now, if you listen carefully, Adrian Belew's singing in all of those 3 albums was really influenced by the style of singing of David Byrne in Talking Heads albums. Byrne has a very distinctive way of singing. It's not exactly what you will call spoken word, and it's not exactly the Sprechensang of opera. Well, you have to listen to it, and you'll see what I mean. It's really a very distinctive style, and it was very influential in Adrian Belew's eventual singing in King Crimson. So I got time for one honorable mention, and I'm going to give it to a Puerto Rican band because, you know, well, that's how things work. Anyway, 2006, Balloon. If you've never heard of this band, I suggest you check them out. They're almost on every single top Latin albums of 2018 with their new release, Prisma Tropical. Shout out to them. But my recommendation for this list, and it's an honorable mention, is their album from 2006 called Something Comes Our Way. I really think that is the album that defined the band. And from there on, they could go on experimenting and going into different paths and different directions, but there was always going to be that anchor, was going to be that one album. And if you've never listened to this band, I think that's their best entry point. That's, you know, that's my favorite album from them. Okay, is there a number 1? Of course there is a number 1. Okay, some of you might have noticed that I have a t-shirt on which says Dead Can Dance. I'm not sure if in fact the Dead can dance. I got my daughter laughing over there. But the truth of the matter is that you should give a try to this band. This band is basically two guys, a guy and a girl from Australia. They are amazing, probably one of the most satisfying and fulfilling experiences you're gonna get out of, I can't call it rock music or prog music, or it's really hard to define what these guys do. Then again, nothing will explain their music better than, just listening to the stuff. And I had to pick one album, so I picked The Serpent's Egg. But really, you can listen to Aeon. You can listen to their new album, which just came out, and it's just as good as anything that they've put out. But I think The Serpent's Egg is just my favorite. It's the one album that I go back to. That one and Splendid Ideal, which is their first album. I think The Serpent's Egg is probably their most complete work. It just makes sense from beginning to end. It's really well thought out. It's, the one album where you say, okay, these people are influenced by New Wave, but they also, they were from the 4AD label, so they fit into that experimental New Wave category, post-rock category, but they also have elements from Gothic music, Gothic rock music, the goth rock at the time. And they also incorporate elements that have, that are linked to classical music. Their singer, it's also somebody who works in elements of glossolalia, which means she just works on phonetics, and she's been hired several times to work on film music, like Gladiator and several other films, which her input has been crucial. But this one album, she really stands out. And her partner in crime also sings. The male voice of the band is also a singer. So that's it. That's the list. And you can write your comments down there. And thanks for watching.